Wonderful. We have a packed room, a packed panel. This is a time we all need to stick together, so it's wonderful to have everybody here today. Good afternoon. I'm Adam Lupel, IPI Vice President. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this policy forum, Trafficking in Persons, Women, Peace and Security, and Peacebuilding. In partnership with the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, Siobhan Mullally. Thank you to our partners, the permanent missions of Ireland, Sierra Leone, and Switzerland to the United Nations. The WPS agenda addresses human trafficking as a form of conflict-related sexual violence. However, there has been a lack of intentional and formal efforts to link the WPS agenda with measures to combat trafficking in persons. So, the goal of today's event is to bridge this gap and highlight how the WPS agenda can help to address the issue of trafficking in persons, providing an opportunity to strengthen both objectives simultaneously. We will also have an occasion to discuss the links between the gendered dimensions of trafficking and post-conflict peace building and sustaining peace. We will hear from member state representatives, UN officials, and civil society experts to share their perspectives on how trafficking in persons and its gendered dimensions relates to the full spectrum of the WPS agenda at the local, national, and multilateral levels. Lots of ambition for this event, but as you can see, we have a tremendous panel here to achieve it all. After we hear from each of our panels, we will have a dedicated time for Q&A, so please prepare your questions. And we will hope to take questions from both our in-person audience and also we've got people online. But before we turn to this excellent panel, which will be moderated by my colleague, Dr. Phoebe Donnelly here, we will hear opening remarks from Ambassador Fergal Mythen, Permanent Representative of Ireland to the United Nations, followed by Onike Spencer Coker, Spokesperson, Permanent Mission of the Republic of Sierra Leone to the United Nations. Ambassador, please, once again, it's always a pleasure to welcome you back to IPI. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Adam. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm always blown away by the energy of CSW. We're into our second week, and I thought people would be flagging, but here we are, full rooms. We had a meeting earlier on in our own mission on gender-based violence. Again, full rooms, packed to capacity, and it just shows the energy. And I'm currently helping to co-facilitate a revitalization process of CSW with my colleague, the Ambassador Botswana. And I think one of our key challenges is to harness this energy so that actually can make a difference beyond this 2 weeks and can continue on out beyond CSW season. So that's very important, but it is very gratifying to be here. And it's a privilege to deliver opening remarks at this event. I want to thank IPI for hosting us. I also want to thank our fellow co-sponsors, Sierra Leone and UN, the Office of High Commissioner for Human Rights, our esteemed participants, and all those who work in the front lines of policy, advocacy, and survivor support. In particular, all politics is local, as Tip O'Neill used to say, and I want to shout out the leadership of 2 really strong Irish women today, Siobhan Mullally, Special Rapporteur of Trafficking in Persons, and Dr. Jennifer O'Keke, the Anti-Trafficking Coordinator at the Immigrant Council of Ireland and Chairperson of the National Women's Council of Ireland, who is joining us here today virtually. My friends, across the world, we're seeing the disproportionate impact of violent conflict, increasing violence on women and girls, and the weaponization of gender-based violence, including trafficking in persons as a tool of war and repression. This year, as we mark the 25th anniversary since the adoption of UN Council Resolution 1325, a resolution that placed women's participation at the heart of international peace and security, it's important that we do more than just hold the line against the backsliding of women, peace and security, just as it's important that we do more than just hold the line against the backsliding on women's rights in general. The severity of the situation we are facing requires us to be ambitious and to dive deeper into the aspects of Resolution 1325 that have not seen as much attention, such as the topic that brings us here today. Trafficking in persons is not only a human rights violation, a grave human rights violation, it is also a direct threat to peace and security and cuts across an array of policy areas, as evidenced by the diversity of experts we have here today. Where there is conflict, where there is displacement, there is also an increased risk of trafficking, and where trafficking networks thrive, they fuel violence, insecurity, and organised crime. It's a vicious cycle where women and girls face particular risks, and no country or region is unaffected. It is vital, therefore, that we recognise the link between human trafficking and the need for peace building. Post-conflict environments where institutions are fragile, where economic opportunities are scarce, provide fertile ground for traffickers to exploit those seeking safety or a new beginning. Effective and sustainable peace building must address the economic and social vulnerabilities that allow trafficking to persist, including by strengthening the rule of law and protecting displaced and refugee women. For Ireland's part, we are deeply committed to integrating anti-trafficking efforts into peace building, and it's no coincidence that our National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security aligns very strongly with our National Action Plan to prevent and combat human trafficking, ensuring a human rights-based, survivor-centred approach. We recognise in Ireland that trafficking is not just a criminal justice issue, it is a development, it is a security, it is a human rights issue, and we have to tackle it accordingly. We are at a crossroads today. The 25th anniversary of both Resolution 1325 and the Palermo Protocol on Trafficking in Persons presents an opportunity to reinforce the synergy between the WPS agenda, the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and the anti-trafficking efforts. To move forward, we want to see action in 3 areas. Firstly, ensuring that relevant peace processes and agreements recognise trafficking as a peace and security issue, integrating survivor-centred and women-led solutions into post-conflict recovery. Secondly, scaling up investment in peace-building programmes and ensuring that they address the root causes of trafficking, from economic insecurity to the marginalisation of women and girls. And finally, strengthen accountability, ensuring that traffickers, including those who exploit conflicts to profit from human lives and human misery, are brought to justice and held to account. And Ireland remains steadfast in its commitment to these goals. And with that, we look forward to today's discussion. And as I said, we don't give up. We be ambitious, we drive on. Thank you very much.
So we have 3 minutes, and I timed myself earlier, so hopefully we stick to the time here. Phoebe, moderator, excellencies, and distinguished guests who are here today. It is an honor to be part of this event, and I look forward to hearing from our panelists and to the deliberations. We thank our friends from the International Peace Institute for inviting us again. Because they've heard from Sierra Leone before, they know we're proud of all the legislative reforms that have been undertaken in recent years in Sierra Leone addressing gender equality, sexual violence, child marriage, and trafficking. Led by efforts of the Ministries of Social Welfare and Justice, in 2022, Sierra Leone adopted the Anti-Human Trafficking and Migrant Smuggling Act to improve collaboration between law enforcement and civil society, take better care of victims, and punish perpetrators with a minimum penalty of 25 years in prison. In our region of West Africa and the Sahel, trafficking as a consequence of conflict, poverty, porous borders, organized crime, and adverse climate events remains a major peace and security challenge. Sierra Leone's new and third National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, adopted last year, addresses trafficking, including training border communities and village parent groups in vulnerable communities on how to detect trafficking, identify potential victims, and refer them for protective services. As we enter the second year of our tenure as a non-permanent member of the Security Council, we're cognizant that this threat has an immense impact on women. Women are victims of traffickers, often forced, coerced, and lured into sexual and other forms of servitude and slavery, including in conflict situations. Trafficking is therefore central to our definition of conflict-related sexual violence. A significant number of the individuals sanctioned in Libya by the UN Security Council have been listed because of their involvement in human trafficking. The UN has reported extensive links between Daesh and human trafficking in Iraq and Syria and in many other places. Trafficking in persons is central to our discussions on Ukraine, Sudan, Myanmar, and DRC. So we welcome this discussion and conclude with 2 general observations. One is that the ILO estimates that the global profits from forced labor and forced sexual exploitation have risen to almost $240 billion a year, excluding forced marriages. Second, the accountability report of the Compact on WPS and Humanitarian Action, which we are proud to be board members of, reported that all signatories spent $1.5 billion on their commitments to WPS and gender-responsive humanitarian action in 2023, which is the last year for which we have data. The scale is clearly tipped in the wrong direction and warrants our attention. Action by the Security Council to call out perpetrators and sanction them is essential, as are the targets in our WPS national action plans. But in order to effectively address the underlying factors driving trafficking, we also have to make sure that at the national, regional, and global levels, legal and regulatory frameworks, as well as socioeconomic plans and policies, support the empowerment of women and girls, with full agency to participate and help prevent trafficking in the first place. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Adam, Ambassador Mythen, and Onike. I really appreciated those really tangible, substantive opening remarks. So thank you for starting us off with a great discussion. Thank you also to our partners on this event, the Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, the Permanent Mission of Ireland, the Permanent Mission of the Republic of Sierra Leone, and the Permanent Mission of Switzerland. Thank you also to this energetic, full audience today. Welcome to IPI, and thank you also to our online audience. My name is Phoebe Donnelly, and I lead the Women, Peace, and Security program here at IPI. I will be moderating today's panel. We have quite a large, great panel of experts. I won't read their full bios. I'm just going to introduce each one with their title. I'll kick off with each of the panelists. I'll pose a question. They'll give a short response, and then we'll open it up to Q&A. And so we are asking panelists to limit their responses to 5 to 7 minutes, but feel free to pick up on anything they say during the Q&A. So to start us off, Siobhan Mullally, Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children. And Siobhan, we wanted to ask you, what's the importance of linking the trafficking in persons and women, peace, and security agendas? Can you elaborate on some of the recommendations made in your 2024 annual report, particularly those related to action plans, programs, and measures related to WPS?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to IPI and to our partners, Permanent Missions of Ireland, Sierra Leone and Switzerland. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity. This was a topic that I addressed in my report to the General Assembly in October. We are now more than 20 years since the adoption of Security Council Resolution 1325 and also 25 years this year of the Palermo Protocol, the Trafficking in Persons Protocol. So it is very timely to look at the intersections of trafficking and the WPS agenda. And a review of national action plans reveals that there has been limited attention to date to trafficking in persons. And it's very good to hear of the work of Sierra Leone, and I would also commend the work of Ireland in looking at the intersections between trafficking and the WPS agenda. We have seen recognition of trafficking in persons for purposes of sexual exploitation or sexual slavery as a form of sexual violence in conflict, and that has contributed to attention to trafficking in conflict settings. But we see less attention to other forms of trafficking that are prevalent in conflict and post-conflict and transitional societies, including forced labor, recruitment and use of children, forced marriage, and forced criminality, which particularly affects young people, affects migrants, and we are increasingly seeing impacts on persons with disabilities. Armed groups in conflict settings are directly involved in trafficking in persons, and in post-conflict and transitional societies, we see that armed groups may persist and continue to use trafficking as a strategy to maintain their activities. But there is also often an overlap with criminal activities, which have the potential to destabilize peace-building measures. And it's important to note that trafficking can occur internally within states and cross-border. It's often a misperception that it can only be cross-border. One recommendation that I have is the need for increased attention to forced labour and to diverse forms of trafficking in persons, and to look at business and human rights agendas and to make the link there around the role of businesses in conflict settings and in transitional and post-conflict societies. We also need to expand the gender lens. We do see failures to identify men and boys as victims of trafficking, particularly for purposes of sexual exploitation and sexual slavery. And we also need to recognise that LGBT persons and persons of diverse gender identities may face additional risks of trafficking due to discrimination and violence, including in situations of displacement and conflict, as a consequence of marginalisation and limited employment or regular migration opportunities. We also need to see increased attention to the realisation of economic and social rights in WPS agendas, which are essential to prevention of trafficking. Achievement of just and fair conditions of work, food security, access to education, and highest attainable standards of health, adequate housing. These are all essential to prevention of trafficking in transitional and post-conflict societies. Climate conflict and displacement also contributes to risks of trafficking in persons due to displacement, loss of livelihoods, potentially increasing unsafe migration and risks of exploitation. And that can have particular implications for women's security, as women may be exposed to higher probabilities of gender-based violence, including trafficking in persons, while accessing resources for livelihoods in situations of conflict and transition. We need to see more attention to the prevention of trafficking in peacebuilding and disarmament and small arms control agendas. The prevalence of arms, in particular small arms and light weapons, contributes to risks of trafficking by non-state armed groups and in the context of criminal activities. And I've seen that firsthand in my country visits, in visiting IDP camps, protection of civilian camps, and looking at situations of displacement. And that prevalence of small arms and weapons undermines the achievement of peace and security, and trafficking is directly linked to that destabilizing impact. We do see attention to disarmament and the links between sexual violence and conflict, but not to the urgency of disarmament in anti-trafficking programs and measures and making that link in WPS agendas. It is something that I highlighted in my country visit to Colombia, where we did see attention to those linkages. On accountability, I would just note that the role of international justice is critical, and it has been highlighted, the attention to crimes against migrants in the Libyan context, for example, in several Security Council resolutions, but we are not seeing a follow-through on that. So we don't see a follow-through in the work of the International Criminal Court. We don't see attention to trafficking in persons in transitional justice processes, or in accountability mechanisms established by the UN, fact-finding missions, commissions of inquiry, for example. The Libya fact-finding mission would be an exception to that. And different forms of trafficking may be identified, such as recruitment and use of children or sexual slavery and enslavement, but the patterns and systemic nature of trafficking are not directly addressed as such, so it remains invisible. So we need to ensure that those mandates explicitly reference trafficking if there is to be accountability. We also need to see the capacity of humanitarian actors and protection actors and peacekeepers enhanced, and mandates to explicitly include a focus on trafficking in persons, linking to gender-based violence and child protection, but also looking at the prevalence of other forms of trafficking, such as forced labour, such as forced criminality, which undermines peace and security. On children and armed conflict, I launched a joint study with the SRSG on children and armed conflict in October, looking at the linkages between trafficking and the 6 grave violations against children. Abduction, for example, is often for purposes of exploitation. Sexual violence is often linked to the prevalence of trafficking for purposes of sexual slavery. Attacks in schools is often linked to, is a mechanism for recruitment of children. So we need to see those linkages and integrate the response into monitoring and reporting mechanisms and into accountability, and most importantly, prevention processes. And to conclude, I just want to highlight the importance of civil society partnerships, which is essential to the WPS agenda and also to the trafficking agenda and anti-trafficking agendas. It's an obligation under the Palermo Protocol, and that partnership and leadership of those most affected must be ensured. And they're not just women as a homogenous group, but recognizing the intersections of different axes of discrimination. There has been a failure to pay attention to women with disabilities who may be at increased risk of trafficking in conflict situations, women and girls, particularly in institutional settings, and who victims of trafficking may also acquire disabilities as a result of trafficking. We also know that Indigenous persons, racialized minorities, persons of African descent, minority communities are more at risk of exploitation, including through trafficking in conflict and post-conflict settings. And that needs to be addressed in the design and implementation of WPS agendas and anti-trafficking programs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. And for those who haven't seen it, the report is a really tremendous research with all these rich examples. So thank you for sharing a preview of that report. I'm now turning to Awa Dabo, who's Director and Deputy Head of the Peacebuilding Support Office, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. And I'd like to ask you, how does the Peacebuilding Support Office work to address the gendered dimensions of trafficking in persons in conflict and post-conflict settings?
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Your Excellencies, distinguished delegates, dear colleagues, friends, good afternoon. Maybe first to thank IPI for really hosting us for this very, very important and very topical discussion. The more I listen to the Special Rapporteur, the more I realize how much more we all have to learn. I want to congratulate you for a really excellent briefing, very comprehensive, and I look forward to reading the report. Actually, I have to say I haven't read it yet, but I really welcome your insights and your briefings, and also welcome your initiative to engage with the Peacebuilding Support Office of DPPA, and of course, broadly with all peacebuilding actors. I mean, it's pretty clear that bringing a peacebuilding lens into your research and reporting is indeed very critical for all the reasons Special Rapporteur has just mentioned. We also know very well that integrating trafficking of persons into peacebuilding fosters a much more holistic, a much more comprehensive approach to the prevention of human trafficking. Human trafficking, by its very nature, often remains very hidden, and its complexities can also be lost within the broader discussions on displacement. And we do spend a lot of time, certainly within the peacebuilding world, in speaking about forced displacements, the different types of forced displacement. On top of that, trafficking in persons can also be seen as a criminal justice issue alone, rather than what it is, the comprehensive, complex issue that it is. But by doing so, we can often ignore the underlying causes that allow human trafficking networks to exist and allows them to thrive in the first place. My office, the UN's Peacebuilding Support Office within the Department for Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, like the Special Rapporteur, takes the view that response to trafficking must be victim-centered, and it also must be inclusive. We also know that the prevention of trafficking measures must be embedded across humanitarian development and protection action, as well as within the WPS agenda and the YPS agenda, and be a core element of peacekeeping transitions. A multidisciplinary integrated approach is therefore essential. It must be an approach that considers the root causes of human trafficking, as well as to seek to respond sustainably to the effects of trafficking. And one good way of doing this is what the Special Rapporteur has underscored, which is the need to address trafficking within national action plans on WPS, for example. And so this brings me to my question on how Peacebuilding Support Office works to address the gender dimensions of trafficking in persons in conflict and post-conflict settings. Well, firstly, PBSO supports WPS national action plans. We see them as conflict prevention tools. We know that these action plans, if effectively implemented, can tackle gendered conflict risks. And we know that if not addressed adequately, these risks can create conditions for trafficking. Secondly, we also understand that the prevention of human trafficking can be a key part of countries' national prevention strategies. In recognition of these national prevention strategies, we at PBSO have committed the UN's Peacebuilding Fund to prioritize support this year to national prevention strategies, including ensuring that the specific needs of women and girls are addressed. And already we are receiving quite a number of proposals that speaks to these issues of gender and forced displacement and trafficking. Thirdly, we also understand very well that sustainable peace building requires broad and meaningful national ownership. Therefore, our support is to ensure that these measures are locally driven and that they are context specific and that they address the specific peculiarities of the given conflict. We work to ensure that prevention mechanisms are aligned with national WPS action plans, and so that they can address the urgent needs of countries where human trafficking continues to flourish. Through the UN's Peacebuilding Fund, we prioritize empowering women-led organizations and women peace builders, including women's efforts to prevent and counter human trafficking. Through our projects, especially through the Gender Promotion Initiative, we also focus on empowering women and girls. These projects enhance resilience and they reduce vulnerability to trafficking. And the Peacebuilding Fund has set and consistently met financial targets to advance gender equality and to reinforce protection efforts, including conflict-related sexual violence. While the PBF does not fund trafficking programs directly, we do invest in structural inequalities, in strengthening accountability, and in building state capacity, including law enforcement and transnational governance. The PBF also supports UN entities in combating organized crime, in managing displacement, and in preventing violent extremism. And all these efforts contribute to preventing and responding to human trafficking. So in closing, let me just stress that we all know that women peace builders work effectively across the entire peace continuum, from early warning to prevention to development. So it's important that we continue to support women-led organizations. This is essential to addressing the gender dimensions of trafficking in persons. Women must always be at the forefront of efforts to address the root causes of trafficking, and this includes inequality, it includes marginalization, and it includes poverty. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for really honing in on the prevention side of things and some of the multi-stranded efforts you're undertaking. I'm now turning to the left of myself for an intervention by Alexandra Deer, who's the Gender Coordinator of the UN Security Council Counterterrorism Committee Executive Directorate, or CTED. And Alexandra, I want to ask you about another great and useful report I would plug, but in 2023, CTED released a report towards meaningful accountability for sexual and gender-based violence linked to terrorism. And that report discusses trafficking in persons. Can you elaborate on the recommendations in the report to more effectively link trafficking in persons, gender-based violence, and violent extremism? And what progress or challenges in implementation have you seen?
Thank you very much, Phoebe, and a big thank you to IPI, the Special Rapporteur, as well as the Permanent Missions of Ireland, Sierra Leone, and Switzerland for hosting this event. And it's really wonderful to see such a full house as well. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to highlight some of the particular challenges in addressing trafficking in person linked to terrorism. And I hope that my remarks will dovetail with many of the important issues already raised by the Special Rapporteur, whom I also want to thank for her excellent report. So in light of the limited time, I thought I would highlight three particular challenges that we have identified both in the report and also in our subsequent engagement with member states on these issues. The first challenge is really a persistent lack of gender expertise and gender analysis that can support understanding of this phenomenon and the linkages between trafficking in persons, other forms of sexual and gender-based violence, and terrorism. And what we see very often, in particular within the counterterrorism space, is that this issue is not only poorly understood, but that it is given limited priority. It is unfortunately very often dismissed as something that is not central to counterterrorism, something that perhaps because the majority of victims are women and girls is being thought of as a women's issue and therefore not central to the so-called real threat of terrorism, which is still thought of in more traditional securitized ways. And this leads to really significant gaps in understanding this phenomenon and therefore also in addressing it. And so the first contribution that we were hoping to make with the report is to really show the different ways in which sexual and gender-based violence, including trafficking in persons, are really intrinsic to the way in which terrorist groups operate, how it is part of their ideology, their tactics, their methods of recruitment, of financing, and terrorizing communities. We also show that it is a phenomenon that continues to evolve and that therefore we need to also continue to analyze in its various new manifestations, for example, with regard to more recently the use of new and emerging technologies to facilitate this type of violence. We also show that these acts occur both in situations of armed conflict and in non-conflict settings, and that it is not limited to any one particular type of terrorism or one particular terrorist group, but that it is really something that is being used across the ideological spectrum, and that different types of terrorist groups do exploit gender inequality and related vulnerabilities to perpetrate this kind of violence. I want to emphasize also that we do recognize that sexual and gender-based violence linked to terrorism occurs on a spectrum of gender-based violence and gender inequality within society. It is not just an isolated phenomenon that somehow exists in a vacuum, and that therefore meaningfully and comprehensively addressing the full range of gendered violence is essential. And this is why I think that today's discussion linking these issues with the wider WPS agenda as well as with wider peace-building work is so important. What we see very clearly in the counterterrorism space as an effect of this missing gender analysis that I was mentioning is that gender stereotypes continue to influence how victims of trafficking in persons by terrorist groups are being perceived and are being treated. There are major issues around the stigmatization and vilification of these individuals, and that has real life and very serious implications both for the human rights of these individuals as well as having negative effects, of course, on security. And in that sense, I do want to use this opportunity to emphasize once again the importance of including gender perspectives in counterterrorism, which is still an issue that very often we are being challenged on. We are being asked about why it is actually relevant, if it isn't just a sort of nice academic exercise or something that is a political agenda that is marginal to the actual issues we are concerned with here. And I think this is really a perfect example of how this issue, how including gender perspectives is absolutely essential, both from the perspective of upholding the rights of individuals concerned, as well as ensuring that we have effective and sustainable security responses to these challenges. The second issue that I want to highlight very briefly, and it was already mentioned, is the issue of holding perpetrators to account and some of the challenges that we are seeing in ensuring more effective investigations and prosecutions of these issues. Again, specifically in the counterterrorism space, we see very often a kind of institutional silos and a lack of interagency collaboration, which leads to very fragmented approaches to accountability and a lack of kind of cross-agency expertise on these issues. And we have documented how that really limits the effectiveness of both investigations and prosecutions. Very often there is then a lack, again, of understanding of the actual phenomenon itself, but crucially also of the applicability of different legal frameworks that could be used to pursue accountability for these acts. And our report really centered around a very detailed legal analysis of the different legal frameworks that can be used to pursue justice in this space. And one of the important recommendations was to further enhance awareness raising, but also training and promoting that kind of multidisciplinary interagency approach to ensure that this phenomenon is looked at from these different perspectives, that the different avenues and different legal frameworks are being explored to be able to more effectively pursue justice for these crimes. Then the third and final challenge that I wanted to highlight, and it's already been touched upon, that is the issue of ensuring a survivor-centered approach and the importance of civil society engagement. And so I do want to say that our report did focus on predominantly a criminal justice perspective on accountability. But at the same time, we are mindful, and the report very much acknowledges that criminal justice is, of course, only one type of justice that is relevant here and that survivors themselves seek and of course, deserve. And so while we focus on criminal justice, we do also underscore the importance of wider transitional justice processes, including, in particular, reparations for survivors. And again, here, very important to once again make those links with wider transitional justice and peace-building work. And while CSO engagement has already been highlighted, I do want to reiterate its importance one more time, particularly because I come from a counterterrorism body. And again, within that space, we still see many challenges to ensuring a more inclusive, a more open approach with the inclusion of civil society. But one of the important recommendations that we did make in the report was to ensure participation of survivors, affected communities, and civil society organizations, including women-led civil society organizations, in conceptualizing, designing, as well as monitoring and evaluating transitional justice processes and mechanisms, including reparation programs. And subsequent to the publication of the report, we had some dedicated engagement and consultations with a wide range of civil society organizations from different regional contexts affected by terrorism, and they were able to highlight the really crucial work that they are doing in providing frontline assistance to victims and survivors, advocating on their behalf, and doing this work very often at really a lot of risk to their own personal safety and security under very difficult circumstances. And really their work does deserve a lot more recognition and support. And so this, once again, a very important aspect of how the WPS agenda is crucial for the work that is happening in that space. And with that, I thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexandra, and really for highlighting the importance of the gender perspective and how that really links to all of the presentations today. So it is now my pleasure to virtually tune in. We're so sorry she cannot be here, but Brigitte Chelebon, attorney at law, founder and director, Justice Without Frontiers. Welcome, Brigitte. We wanted to ask you, your organization, Justice Without Frontiers, focuses on the rule of law and access to justice and has been a leading campaign on trafficking and sexual crimes in Lebanon that includes law reform, grassroots training, and a curriculum for security forces. What major gaps have you identified in your work on trafficking, and what concrete steps have you helped to take to address these? Brigitte, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this very important roundtable. Regarding Justice Without Frontiers, and I am from Lebanon, one of the main gaps that we are facing is there is no identification or definition of what is sexual violence, noting that the trafficking is form of sexual violence, so we don't have this definition. And it is very needed what we are working on to define the sexual violence, taking into consideration the international criminal law, specifically the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court, and what the ICTY as well defined regarding this matter. On the other hand, we are working a lot to make sure that the National Action Plan in Lebanon will include the trafficking, and not only as we should work on trafficking, but as well to focus on the prevention, on protection, and on prosecution. Noting that Lebanon adopted a law to combat trafficking in 2011, and Lebanon adopted this law because of the pressure of the U.S. government, and now Lebanon is considered as he is in the watch list. What we are doing right now is that we are bringing all law enforcement agencies together to sit together to define what are the gaps and how they can cooperate together to combat trafficking. And what we realize is that there is no this cooperation together. And what is more dangerous is not all law enforcement agencies and even judges are very aware about what is trafficking. Another issue, the law to combat the trafficking in Lebanon, it criminalized the act of trafficking, but there is no measures taken or regarding the precaution and the protection matter. For this reason, the government recently adopted the standard operating procedures, and there is another draft law submitted to the government to be adopted. As well, now we are working, because we are talking as well on WPS agenda, we got an approval from the Internal Security Forces Directorate to work on a curriculum for security forces, how to conduct a gender-sensitive investigation on trafficking. And we start working on the curriculum, and after that we will be training officers, and we will be conducting a pilot activity in one region. What I think, and I just want to be brief on these matters, what I think it is very important to work on is how to bring justice and how to bring peace building into humanitarian level. In Lebanon, we faced a lot of challenges since 2019. We had the revolution, we had the economic crisis, and recently we had the war with Israel, and the situation is not stable yet. And the percentage of vulnerability in Lebanon increased a lot, so the percentage of abuse as well increased. And since we had economic crisis in Lebanon, even the government and even the law enforcement agencies are not able to take any measures of precaution regarding this matter. But we as Justice Without Frontiers, we succeed to bring justice into humanitarian level. And now we are working as emergency response is to provide protection support for victims and witnesses. Another matter that we need as well to focus on is how to ensure access to justice for victims, how to ensure protection mechanisms for victims and witnesses, measures of protection for victims and witnesses. As well, in my point of view, I think it is very important as well to create a task force of judges, of lawyers, of NGOs who are really aware on what is trafficking, aware about Palermo Protocol, aware about knowing what other success experience there is, or how they can exchange experience with others. Recently, we conducted 2 roundtables with the Ministry of Justice to tackle gaps in the current trafficking law, and we realized, yes, there is a need to work with judges on this matter. And unfortunately, I am saying this. And another issue we have is as well bringing technology. We need to think about technology regarding this matter. Already, 1 or 2 of the panelists mentioned this matter, and as well, the Interpol last year mentioned that most of trafficking matters are are implemented through using the technology. And in May 2024, 300 children in Lebanon were abused using TikTok by influencers. So I think as well, we need to think how we can bring technology on this matter as a tool of trafficking. And finally, I have a request that whenever we are working on issues related to trafficking or justice matters, sometimes the MENA region is not always present. And I really thank you for inviting me from Lebanon to talk on this matter. But always we need to think how we can bring MENA region on this table and how we can support the women-led organization, because we are facing a lot of issues, especially during the last war. The last war and the post-conflict as well, since we were facing not only lack of funding, but there is lack of knowledge how we can identify the frontliners, how they can identify the cases of trafficking, how they can build the referral system. There is a lot of work need to be done. Another matter as well that we need to mention, that we in Lebanon, we are working as well on indicators. For example, one of the indicators of trafficking in Lebanon is the early marriage. One of the indicator of trafficking in Lebanon is non-registered children or non-registered person. And after the war, not after the war, even during the economic crisis in Lebanon, justice system become very expensive. To access justice become very expensive for vulnerable groups. So we have many children, Lebanese children, they are not able, they are not registered. So they could be subject of trafficking. And then my last point, I am sorry, I know I have 5 minutes. We have the kafala system in Lebanon for the migrant workers. So this kafala system, it is considered a trafficking, but unfortunately, on another hand, we have a law that is organizing the work of migrant workers under the kafala system. So there is a lot of work to be done, but again, to combat trafficking, we can start working not only on the UN Security Council Resolution 2025, but as well on 1820, working on pushing to ratify the Rome Statute or to amend the national laws, working on building capacity buildings, to have a task force, a strong task force to work on the prevention, to work on identifying the potential victims, to ensure the protection and to ensure the prosecution, and even to start thinking how we can collaborate between or cooperate between countries even to regarding the protection and regarding the prosecution. And thank you.
Thank you so much, Brigitte. We really, really appreciate your perspective from Lebanon and all of the work it sounds like you're doing. So we're so grateful to have you here and hope you can return in person. I'm now turning to Delphine Chance, who is the director of the New York Liaison Office of the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. Delphine, I wanted to ask you if you could tell us more about your work with technical assistance programs supporting anti-trafficking and how it is informed by your research and analysis and the global report published last year.
Thank you very much, Phoebe, and thank you very much for our host, the IPI, for having us here today, and of course, the co-organizer, Island, Sierra Leone, and Switzerland. I'd like, of course, to pay tribute to Professor Moulali, whose really work has actually been extremely instrumental in the work of the Interagency Coordination Group Against Trafficking in Persons, so-called ICAT, and particularly our approach to gender and trafficking in conflict settings. So now to go to your question, any technical assistance provider bases its work on data. And that's why it was so important for us. And this is a report, working on data enables us every 4 years, whenever we have the appraisal of global plan of action on human trafficking, to publish a dedicated report on human trafficking to take stock of the main trends. We issued in 2024, November 2024, the latest iteration of this global trafficking report, so-called GLOTIP. And really the picture that it depicts is actually quite alarming. In 2022 alone, victims of 162 different nationalities were identified in 128 different countries. Conflicts and displacement, of course, are fueling these trends as the world becomes much more interconnected, and the traffickers are most of the time ahead of the law enforcement response. But in 2022, 61% of trafficking victims detected were female, and most of them continue to be trafficked for sexual exploitation. Victims are trafficked globally through an increasing number of international routes, and particularly with a focus on African victims trafficked in the highest number of destinations. In parallel, and it's a very alarming trend, the number of children among the detected victims is also growing, with a third over the space of 3 years. And we see a number of girls detected have surged, increasing by 38% from the last 2022 report. In several regions, children now account for the majority of victims detected in regions such as Europe, East Asia, and North Africa. So trafficking in persons in the context of conflict can take various forms of exploitation of children by armed groups to use as soldiers, but also armed groups also engage in trafficking of women and girls to reward their fighters, either in sexual exploitations or to use them as slaves. So how do we then translate this data into our technical assistance work? So one of the examples is the work that we have on victim identification and protection. Very often we see that the survivors are becoming unnoticed or undetected. Sometimes they fear the law enforcement and they do not necessarily want to report that they've been trafficked or tell more because they're traumatized, or they don't necessarily want to tell a story that will actually be very helpful for the law enforcement to collect some very important data, information, including financial data, to be able to identify the entire magnitude of the network. So we've been integrating gender responsive approaches into the legal framework. So in many countries, trafficking laws don't account for the unique vulnerabilities of women and girls. So they've been complying with the Palermo Protocol, but not necessarily with a very victim-centered approach. And therefore, it's actually very difficult to make sure that these particular perspectives is included both in the laws and in the various regulations. But particularly, one of the most important part of this work is also to inform the work of the ICAT as kind of a driver for policy decisions. So ICAT has like a rotating chairmanship. This year, it's for the next year and a half, will be UNODC and the Organization of American States. So ICAT has actually been publishing briefs on the gender dimension of trafficking in persons since 2017. And they normally inform each time there is a new appraisal of the global plan of action. So some of the 3 main priorities for this year will be the promotion and inclusion of perspective of voices of survivors in trafficking in the design and implementation of anti-trafficking initiatives. The focus on the survivors is also a great part of UNODC's work, and we'll be organizing our first survivors forum in June in Vienna. We also be the increasing, and it's actually been a point that's been made on the nexus between human trafficking and all the other forms of crime, and both organized crime or terrorism. And of course, sustaining the focus on children trafficking. So continuing the work of the ICAT has actually done on the accelerated action towards children trafficked in 2025. So exploitation of forcibly displaced person may occur in different phases, in different places along the journey. So either in the camps, in the refugee camps, the resettlement areas. But we see that we the victims are not only detected in the country where we see those displacement population, but we see and we look at another of our GLOTIP report of 2022. We had seen that nationals from the African countries that have left their countries in conflict, particularly in Central Sahel, in CAR or the Democratic Republic of Congo, have accounted for more than 2,000 victims that have been identified in Europe. So you really see that wherever this trafficking are taking place, that's actually come to almost globally. So it's not only focusing on one area, but is really getting the full picture. Trafficking in conflict setting remains one of the most unaddressed threat to peace and security and stability, as we've actually seen. And armed groups definitely, and it's actually been proven, or including through the reports of CTED, benefit from trafficking. In many cases, it funds organized crime and terrorist activities. And yet we've actually seen there's a response that the Security Council has been given to this, particularly since the adoption of the resolution 2388, as kind of falling away. There was actually an opportunity for the Council to really call for, particularly on this sanctions committee, to look for potential links between terrorism and human trafficking, yet very few countries have actually been designated these individuals in particular contexts, highlighting this nexus. According to the GLOTIP report, trafficking of ex-combatants and displaced persons remains a persistent issue. And trafficking survivors often face economic hardship and the lack of support needed. And we see this, that the DDR programs are not at all being necessarily equipped to respond to this call and the stigma that some of the survivors are facing. So if you look at our own technical assistance program, particularly in Ukraine, we're working with the national authorities through the UN Transitional Framework and the joint interagency projects to improve the victim identification, working very closely with the frontliners to be able to detect situations of trafficking. So that's looking at borders and containers. When they actually see a situation or facing with individuals that potentially could be trafficked, to be able to report this information to the law enforcement activities. In Haiti, we're supporting the Haitian National Police Anti-Trafficking Unit, Polyfront, helping them to identify the human trafficking networks that operate alongside criminal gangs. And we've seen actually an increasing number, particularly with the Haitian community that have actually fled the country and the displaced population, a real need to be able to also exchange information and work at the very cooperation at between Haitian and some of the jurisdictions in the Caribbean, for which, there's also not so much information is actually done. But very often we see some of those flows, but some information not going back, not feeding back into Haitians so they can actually take action from the start. So at the end, we just three main points where we think not only government, but also international organizations should really focus on is really that survivors are should be meaningfully included in anti-trafficking policies and program. And that's why we really want to have this anti-trafficking summit so that we actually get their perspective and we see how we can best translate this into decision-making, into not only laws, but also some of the guidance that are very useful for law enforcement, particularly for the work of the law enforcement community that is normally looking at the network, but not necessarily looking at the victim side. Trafficking should be recognized as a key issue in conflict response, and particularly in the context of the DDR processes. And finally, as was mentioning by Sandra, the gender-sensitive, victim-centered approach that should be embedded in the law enforcement and judicial responses. So as Shaban was mentioning, we marked this year the 15th year since the adoption of the first Global Plan of Action, and 25 years since the adoption of the dedicated protocol on human trafficking as part of the Palermo Convention. So the threat has evolved, but it still remains, and it's actually more increasing, and the trends are there, and the data are there to actually substantiate that indeed this is still an increasing and very, very, very difficult issue that needs to be addressed. The upcoming political declaration, part of the Global Plan of Action, which will be negotiated towards now until November, is an opportunity for member states to really shed light and put really the victim-centered approach, particularly including in the context of conflict settings. So this is an opportunity that hopefully member states will seize. And by working together, not only international organization, but also government, the civil society and the private sector, because they also have a lot of very valuable information to bring into the detection of networks and the dismantling of those networks, because ultimately human trafficking is a lucrative crime. And people engaged in human trafficking, well, with the exception of some terrorists, because we know that they use this as in a particular motive, but most of the time by criminal groups is really to make money. So we have to also see where we can really hurt them the most, is to deprive them from the main reason why they're engaging to this activity. And again, put the whole context of the women and girls in the center, because we have to make sure that our action will really give them their dignity back and provide them with opportunities also to reintegrate themselves, because that's very often they're deprived from any economic opportunities to be able to overcome their trauma and to go back into society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think you set us up perfectly for our final panelist, Thomas Contagiorgos, the chief of the UN Disarmament, Demobilization and Reintegration Section. And Thomas, we wanted to ask you about the links between the gender dimensions of trafficking and peace building and post-conflict processes like DDR. How can DDR programs be better integrated with anti-trafficking efforts, particularly in addressing the vulnerabilities of women and girls in post-conflict settings?
Thank you, Phoebe. Many thanks to IPI for inviting me, also to the embassies of Ireland, Sierra Leone, and Switzerland for taking up such a difficult subject, and also to the rapporteur. Let me start by wishing all of you happy Nowruz Day, and particularly to those celebrating it. Actually, it's today, and we as UN, sometimes we only focus on specific celebrations around the year, which are probably most of the time Western-like. The Nowruz marks actually the end of the winter and the arrival of the spring, and symbolizes fresh beginning. So probably the transformation of nature can inspire us to leave behind the political winter that we have started to experience a few weeks ago, probably a few months ago, and more importantly, the winter that comes from lack of multilateralism, and probably have a new start and a fresh start, all of us. I think that's important for the rapporteur and for the theme that the rapporteur actually is dealing with. Let me come to DDR, which is a rather mission impossible. But that said, at the same time, DDR has evolved considerably over the last 15 years. And that's because what we experience out there is a situation where we see proliferation, fragmentation of armed groups, regionalization of the conflict, violent extremism, terrorist organizations, but also no clear political agendas and rather predatory focus of the armed groups. Now, as if this was not enough for all of us, we see also diminishing funding, political instability, and lack of multilateralism in many and various contexts. Now, the DDR has been revised over the last years, and it's not only a tool or a process that is implemented after the end of the conflict, as endorsed by the Secretary General in 2020. I'll spare you the details. I'll only say one word. DDR is now part of the sustaining peace approach and offer inputs to prevention. I'll come at the end of how this could be done. Conflict resolution, peace building, and development. So several tools that have been developed over the last 15 years can facilitate and support various groups, various vulnerable groups, including trafficked persons. But let me come to a criminal element of our discussion. Often I hear when we present on armed groups a question. This armed group is involved in trafficking XYZ. Does this make them a criminal organization? The answer is no. Because if we go down that road, we diminish ourselves when it comes to solutions, and we diminish ourselves for offering support to vulnerable groups, particularly trafficked persons. The majority of the armed groups are involved in the trafficking of persons. They are heavily involved, from Colombia to Haiti to Sahel, and colleagues mentioned it before, to South Africa, to Sub-Saharan Africa, to North Africa, and so on and so forth. This is a multi-billion dollar industry. It affects 40 million people around the world. 60% are women and girls. Actually, 40 million, that could be easily a middle-sized country around the world with probably specific rights. Now, the armed groups are also involved because this links with what we're discussing to the other two top global crimes: drug, I'm sure the colleagues from the office from DC know that, and the illicit trafficking of weapons. These three things are like this, like the Holy Spirit, the God and the Jesus. They come together. And what is interesting is that the trafficked people, most of the time, are used to reinforce and increase the profit for the other two areas. So trafficked people can also facilitate the trafficking of drugs and also illicit weapons. Now, why is this all? Obviously, it was mentioned. It brings the necessary finances to continue their struggle. Whether that is right or not, let's not go into this direction. But also it asserts territorial control, particularly SGBV. SGBV in many parts of the world is used by the armed groups in order to mark territory, inflict an impact when it comes to other armed groups and so on and so forth, generate personal gains, and enforces recruitment and re-recruitment, particularly of youth and also women and girls. Now, in all this situation, the women and girls are the vulnerable players. And it was mentioned the sexual exploitation, forced marriage, forced labor, domestic support, and so on and so forth. I'll go quickly through 5 examples, and that's because it's important for you to understand what these people are going through. Last month, clashes erupted among rival armed groups in Khartoum in Libya. The violence spread rapidly and affected migrants, other vulnerable groups, including trafficked persons. Actually, they were trying, the armed groups, to harm each other, and at times, they were trying to kill the opponent's trafficked commodity to deplete them from resources in order to make an income. Abducted girls by the Liberation Tamil Tigers, back at the time, they had their hairs cut. And that's actually against the local tradition. At some point, they were freed from the armed group, and some girls were reluctant to return home. Some colleagues already mentioned the stigmatization. This is huge. And it takes years and years and years and specific programming to address it. So the fearing of the stigma of these girls made them return back to the group because they couldn't go back to the communities. Islamic State, interestingly, systematically separated captives by sex and age, ensuring young and unmarried girls were trafficked the fastest and first. So they were on top of the list. I'll come to the last example, and apology for the harsh language. In Haiti, and I want to take this example because it's interesting and it brings another angle to what we're discussing. A notorious gang leader in Port-au-Prince, Izo, kidnapped a surgeon's wife from Canada, asking the surgeon to come to Haiti to save her. When the surgeon arrived in Haiti, he made the surgeon operate children and young people, women, in order to extract the organs. Yes, but it's a reality also. Trafficking, it's not only limited to people. It also, I think, this is an important aspect to bring to the table. So, particularly they were interested, apology for this, in the uterus, because this is of high interest to neighboring countries, particularly to Jamaica, as many women are seeking to have a transplant. Anyway, let me come to a message from our side. The ambassador referred to it, I believe others. In conflict settings, trafficked persons, particularly women and girls, are the invisible victims, are the invisible group. The attention is low because of very important element. They represent a limited currency when it comes to this group, when we are looking for resolution to the conflict. They don't sit at the negotiating table. They will never sit at the negotiating table, and no one hears them. And that's the reality. If it's not for the international community, for the rapporteur, and probably some people in the system, the mediators never pay attention to this group. Point. Probably to children, but not to trafficked persons. Criticism. DDR processes, I fully agree. They lack sensitivity and tools to correctly categorize these individuals based on their association with armed groups, their gender or other characteristics. And this is something that we need to fix, but for that we need support from the member states. Let me now come to the second part of the question very quickly. What we need, strong coordination mechanisms and information sharing, data gathering, data processing, data understanding, it's important. And that has to bring different actors together. DDR actors, law enforcement, protection services, gender and child protection experts. We need them to tailor programming and assistance to the trafficked persons addressing the specific forms of trafficking, forced labor, sexual exploitation, organ trafficking. It's a totally different category. It's not the same thing. Forced combat, people that are used in a combative role under duress. Psychosocial support. From our side, we keep saying this again and again, not only to the disarmed, demobilized combatants, so we avoid the whole aspect of recidivism. Obviously, of course, also as part of gender-sensitive reintegration plans to support survivors of trafficking effectively. Now, DDR forms part of a broad process, and of course, with many thanks to PBSO colleagues for supporting these processes, from humanitarian, social, economic development, and so on and so forth. There is a need to integrate anti-trafficking frameworks, national referral mechanisms, and survivor support networks into the early stages of the peace and DDR processes. Let me come to my 3 recommendations. There are 3 pillars to what concerns addressing human trafficking. PPPs, prevention. When we invest in consolidating peace processes, and the Ambassador Riguera alluded to that, I believe both of you, if we want to remove incentives from the armed groups, we need to get involved in the business of strengthening reintegration of former combatants and for the victims of the trafficking. That requires money. Let's be clear. It's not that you integrate people with thin air. This is the best remedy when it comes to removing from the armed groups the incentive for engaging in this area. Now, drawing from the child protection initiatives, we need campaigns to raise awareness with the armed groups. Most of the armed groups, they don't know that trafficking of individuals is a crime against humanity. They don't know that they will face criminal justice in the aftermath of the conflict. But I'll come to that now in 1 second. So what we need is awareness campaigns to tell the armed groups, and we have employed these kind of practices in Congo, but not for trafficked people, for children. And I kindly invite here the rapporteur to look at how we can devise practices, mechanisms, and procedures so the armed groups, particularly middle-level commanders, are aware of what they're committing and how they will face the consequences. So that's under prevention. Protection. Confidence-building measures that we're looking as part of the peace process could and should, in our opinion, and again, we drawing from the child protection environment, offer the immediate and unconditional release of trafficked people in different contexts as a confidence-building measure between and among state institutions and armed groups and so on and so forth. This has been done in some parts of the world. Again, not for trafficked victims, but only for the children. This again can be something that can, and finishing with prosecution, the last P. Transitional justice is part of the comprehensive peace agreement. Everybody mentioned it. I guarantee you, if it's not in the CPA, it's not going to be implemented. And what I mean is that no one from an armed group will ever be held accountable unless if this is part of the comprehensive peace agreement. And it's fully detailed that as part of the post-conflict process, this is addressed. That's why it's important that mediators, when they support these processes, are aware of the issue and what could be done. I'll leave it there. And my very, very last point, the nexus between organized crime and armed groups is very important. It's only proliferating and the gray areas are only growing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. So we're now going to turn to the audience interaction component of the event. So I already see a hand up. While we're getting microphones around and hands up, we do have one more civil society speaker who's joining us virtually to just give a short comment, and that is Jennifer Akoke from the Anti-Trafficking Coordinator at the Immigrant Council of Ireland. So Jennifer, if you're there and you wanted to give a 1-minute intervention. Well, perhaps she's not here. No, that's Brigitte.
I am here.
Oh, okay, we can't see you.
Can you
Oh,
hear
there
me?
you are. Okay, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, IPI, and greetings from here in Ireland. 1 minute, I don't know what I'm going to say in 1 minute, to be honest. I suppose if you look at the data on women who have been trafficked and why it should be a gendered crime, why it is a gendered crime, it's also highlighting the fact that, I mean, the trend of it being a gendered crime has been consistent globally at the EU level, even here in Ireland, because again, the victims consistently are women. And again, if you look at the children that have been trafficked, the greater number of them are very young girls, very young girls being trafficked, especially for sexual exploitation. And that is just looking at it in broader terms. Now, when you go into certain regions and go into sexual exploitation specifically, the number, of course, begins to increase. But I think I'm just gonna, because I have just 1 minute, I'm just gonna leave everything I had wanted to say and just go into what I think what is very important for me to say today is that it is very important that we recognize that there is still global disparities that exist between the North and South. None of the push or the pull factors have disappeared, whether we are looking at war, new conflicts, climate change, or certain pull factors that are specific to the North. If you say, for example, if you're looking at demand, whether it's demand for cheap labor, demand for specific kind of women in the sex trade, those pull factors and the push factors, they've not disappeared, they are still there. And a lot of them they continue to put women in very vulnerable situation. Again, I know a lot of you have mentioned the survivor piece. It is important that we move from that survivor center to survivor led, that it remains a priority. I think it's a very important approach whereby survivors are central to shaping the policies and building solutions and not just being included in the process. Because again, there's been a push by survivors themselves that they want to be part of this, and rightfully so. But it's also important, just like Thomas had mentioned, that when we are talking about, because when we talk about survivors and victims, it means the crime has already happened. There is no focus on the prevention. And I think the prevention, we need to begin to put a lot of focus on the prevention and the preventive piece and what can be done. But more importantly, is also recognizing that it is a crime and then asking ourselves, this crime, what resources do we put there? What resources do we have to tackle the crime? Are our police force equipped to be able to fight this crime and the criminal gangs? Are the people in the front line, are they adequately resourced to be able to create the awareness that is needed within marginalized communities, and to be able to support or help women and young girls who are at the risk of being trafficked? Again, I've been asked, why is United Nations very important? I think demands the attention of the United Nations, but more importantly, also it demands the commitment of member states to be able to fight this heinous crime. And because I have just 1 minute, I'll end with this quote.
Yes, you're actually frozen. So I think if we could conclude there, but we wish you were here and we hope to continue to engage with you. We do have a few audience questions. My colleagues are with the microphone, so I'll let you kind of distribute them, maybe one in the back and one up front. So if someone wants to start, that's person in the back. And keep your questions very short, please.
Hi, my name's Jose Garcia. I'm with the Leone NYC network. For anyone who's not familiar with Leone, it's a women's support network. So my question is, But one of the challenges with human trafficking is that it's a big, part of the reason why it's one of those cases where, evil triumphs when the good man does nothing. What are we doing to shrink the distance between those who are in power and those who are victims? Because if we don't bridge that gap, the decision makers aren't going to have the heart or the empathy that's needed to really address this issue. And that's why it's been going on for so long.
Thank you. I think we had a hand up here.
Thank you. I'm Dr. Donnelly. I would like, and I would like to add two very important anniversaries this year for governments and all of us to pay attention to. One is the United Nations Declaration of Principles of Justice for Victims of Crime and Abuse of Power, which was a UN ODC in the old name child, 40 years old. And the second is the 20th anniversary of the guidelines for reparation resolution. And these are, when we were creating those, including the resolution on domestic violence, also 40 years old. So we have to do a lot of work on both the global picture and the particular victimization categories to not forget what we already have and to build on it. Thank you. Just one more terrible story to add to
I think we're going to have to skip the, I'm sorry to skip the terrible story. We'll have one more question, then we'll turn it back for rapid fire closing remarks. Do you want to go right here, I guess? Very concise.
Yes, very good. Thank you so much to everybody. Ali Mazzara with Geneva Global. Question is related to getting after the money. Have there been any examples of getting to the top of the pyramid? Because really often if we get to just the next level, it's not helping because those people are also in poverty, and not saying that it's right. And then quickly, as most of us are based in New York right now, what can we do in New York? How can we recognize people who are being trafficked here and help them?
Great, thank you so much. Okay, we're going to go in reverse order, rapid fire response closing. Thomas, over to you.
Okay. To the colleague about shrinking the gap between those in power and the victims, am I right? That's the question? Yeah. I have no straightforward answer. I mean, I think one way that I've seen working at times is that those who take the decision when it comes to vulnerable groups, possibly also when it comes to the trafficked people, is that at times they don't really understand the level of sorrow, the level of stressful situation that they put these victims. But obviously, as you can imagine, the economic incentive is above all. So I think, and it was mentioned earlier, one way to do that is to tackle the economic incentive. And also, I think it's important to understand that there is a demand. So, and that probably links with the other question, what you can do in New York. Obviously, the demand in this country, I believe, at times is high to what concerns particular type of trafficked people. How you diminish the demand and how at the same time you promote processes that allow those who want to come into this country and offer services, but through legal channels, I think that will be in the right direction. About the declarations, I think this is most welcome.
Thank you. Delphine, rapid fire.
Thank you very much. I think one key area is data. If you want to have a change, if you want to have the political will, if you want to have clear changes in decision-making, you need to really base your arguments with data. And that's why it's so important to have those kind of reports that, you know, many of the UN agencies, but also CSOs are publishing, because this is really, this is how you inform member states, and this is how you can really get some changes. So Data, yes, we have international organizations that are contributing to this, but then we have also a number of CSOs that do this. And that's why it goes really back to the importance of having them included at any step of the way, both in the, not only to as beneficiaries of some of the assistance, but also as contributing to some of the programming upfront, and that is very essential. Yes, it has actually been some cases where an entire network has actually been dismantled through, following the money. It does. There are not so many cases because very often in government officials, you have a complete disconnect between the entities that are dealing with financial crime and the other one that are actually doing with the crime, with obviously a focus necessarily on the victims and not necessarily a proper debriefing on some of the information that would be actually key. There's been an increasing cooperation with the private sector in this area. And I'd like just to refer to the FAST initiative that is actually now hosted by UNDP, but under the government of Liechtenstein has actually been supporting this work in really identifying very interesting piece of research and really helping investigator translate some of the very interesting Security Council resolution that we're dealing in this area. And finally, how do we actually help New York? There are a number of CSOs that are actually working in communities as really frontliners and doing a fantastic work because they're in the contact with the communities. So it's really supporting them, helping them, providing them with resources because obviously resources are very, very scarce and they need the support more than ever.
Thank you. Brigitte, very quick.
Yes, very quick. I just want to focus on 2 points. It is very important, again, to work on laws and to ensure not only the impunity, but as well the immunity of the grave crimes committed, as well to work on cooperation on the national and international level to ensure the prosecution and to ensure the protection of victims and witnesses, and to have these clear mechanisms. Regarding the numbers, I'm sorry, we are in Lebanon, the electricity went. So again, okay, regarding the victims, I think it is very important not to count victims, not to say we have 50 women victims or hundreds of women, but to go more deep is to identify what kind of trafficking, of crimes of trafficking are committed against these women and these girls, because as mentioned, it's not only sexual harassment or sexual exploitation. For example, in Lebanon, any crimes mentioned in the penal code could be crimes of trafficking in case of availability of the elements of crime. It is very important not to focus our work as international community with the international organization, since we are working on localization as well, but to focus on the national organization. And regarding the mediation, I think we are working on, but I think we need to learn more from your experience, maybe in later stage, about how we can involve mediation.
Thank you so much. Alexandra.
Very quickly, just on the question of what more we can do being based here. I mean, look, I think there is so much that can be done in terms of raising awareness of these issues. And we've all provided examples of that and highlighted that need. Delphine talked about the importance of data. I think in addition to data, also just telling the stories. And we've heard some very powerful examples that are also important in terms of humanizing these horrific experiences, promoting the solutions that do exist in terms of legal frameworks, in terms of types of assistance that victims require. And I think all of these issues are important so that we can try to get the political will there to address these issues. Because without that political will, again, you don't have the resources, you don't have the prioritization that this issue requires. And that's really very often the stumbling block. So I think we can do a lot.
Thank you. Awa.
Thank you. So very quickly, I think a lot of points have already been said. I just wanted to say that, in fact, what we are talking about is not dissimilar to many of the challenges we face in conflict. countries, in the sense that there is seriously a lack of trust, if you like, between the populations and the government. And for ultimately, it's an issue of accountability as well. I'm just going to the first point about how do we bring the people closer to the government. So I do think the UN, for example, certainly has a lot of an important role it can play in facilitating the engagement. I think these sort of issues need a multiplicity of ways in which we can address. The issue of political will, I think, is important. So the engagement with Security Council is important, the engagement with Peacebuilding Commission, to make sure that you're bringing this to the table. And for those of you who are asking, what can you do? Well, you can also advocate to member states. You can advocate to partners to ensure that this is something that's taken seriously, because it does have an impact on people's life. And there is ultimately an issue of accountability. So I think that's one. I think, again, in bringing victims closer to member states, well, we talked about the importance of victim-led processes, empowering victims, ensuring that we are in solidarity to victims, so that for those of us who fund these projects at country level, that we are capacitating them so that they have a level playing field, and they have a leg under a foot at the table, or a foot through the door, so they can actually engage and can speak to these issues. I think that's one. Just one last point I wanted to mention, which is that I wanted to say, yeah, all very interesting, because the prevention discussion we've talked about, we talk about it a lot, and we in Peacebuilding talk about it, but it's so complex. It's so complicated. And for me, ultimately, that's what it's about. If you ask yourself, why are young people willing to cross the Mediterranean, taking risks? It is about development. It's about root causes. It's about development deficits. And that requires resources. It requires commitment. It requires political commitment for all of us. And that certainly takes time. Just want to say that. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll give the last word to Special Rapporteur Siobhan.
Thank you very much. It's been a really rich discussion, and I hope will lead to concrete actions. Very quickly, in relation to the point around shrinking the gap, here, what I started to ask around, why was there a lack of attention to trafficking in persons consistently in protection and humanitarian settings, in conflict settings, and in accountability processes? One of the responses that I received a lot was, well, it's not seen as serious, as pressing. There are so many other pressing issues, serious human rights violations, violations of international humanitarian and criminal law. So it's a little bit about like the conversation around sexual violence in conflict and rape and sexual violence that was for many years not seen as pressing, not seen as urgent. And that we need to address, in particular by bringing forward the perspectives and experiences of victims and through survivor-led responses, and recognizing that those who are affected most, yes, they're often women and girls, but they're refugee women, stateless women, migrant women, minoritized and racialized women, women of African descent, indigenous women, minority women. And that is also linked to the reasons why it's not as visible, it's not on the agenda, not integrated. When I asked about why wasn't it systematically in WPS action plans and programs, it was, well, they're already crowded. Why add another issue? Not recognizing the systemic nature of this serious human rights violation and violation of international humanitarian law and international criminal law. So we need to address that and the intersections of disadvantage and discrimination that lead to that invisibility. And we need to recognize that victims of trafficking are not only invisible, they are also sometimes criminalized or punished in different ways by not being assisted, by being deported. Children may be punished and prosecuted, and adults. So they are not recognized as victims of trafficking. Who is recognized and who's not recognized is really critical. And that's often also racialized and linked to minority status and migration status. Look at those who are in situations in camps in Northeast Syria, recruited as children, often girls, for forced marriage, forced pregnancy, sexual exploitation, domestic servitude, but not recognized as such. Why? Yeah. So we need to ask those questions, why, and we need to address them through concrete actions. And yes, some victims of trafficking in children are released as part of peace agreements and DDR processes, but they're often left unsupported without long-term assistance and protection measures, psychosocial assistance, reproductive and sexual health care, long-term reintegration, education and training measures. And what happens? They become re-trafficked again. They become re-victimized again. So it's a continuing cycle. So it's not enough just to have release. We need to have the long-term assistance and protection measures without discrimination. Non-discrimination is a core norm of anti-trafficking law and of international law. So that needs to be recognized in practice and in fact. Thank you.
Please join me in thanking our speakers. Thank you all for being here. This concludes our event.